Kaiser Deu had taken 7 Omegas into his house. Not one of them lasted a week. In the upper circles of the ABO Mafia world, that fact had become more than gossip. It had become entertainment. Men drank expensive liquor and placed quiet bets behind closed doors. Women whispered over dinner tables. Omegas from powerful families said his name like a warning. Some said Kaiser was too violent, even for an alpha. Some said his pheromone was so oppressive that an Omega could not breathe around him for more than a few days. Others said the Deu estate was cursed, that something lived behind the locked doors on the second floor, something even money and power could not hide. Nobody knew the truth. And Kaiser never bothered correcting them. He had learned long ago that people preferred rumors to answers. Rumors were easier to digest. Rumors made monsters simple. And Kaiser Deu, head of the Deu family, owner of half the city's underground routes and enough legal businesses to clean the rest, was already the kind of man people wanted to fear. He was an alpha with a reputation built on control. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten twice. He did not waste movement, words, or mercy. When he entered a room, even other alphas lowered their eyes before they realized they were doing it. But there was one thing Kaiser Deu could not control, and that truth stayed locked inside his estate. Knox Keller had never expected to be dragged into a story like his. Knox was an Omega, but not the kind people wrote songs about, not the kind wealthy alpha families displayed like proof of taste. He worked as a caregiver, moving from sick rooms to small apartments, from elderly patients to unstable recovery cases, doing the quiet work no one respected until they desperately needed it. His pheromone was faint. His status was ordinary. His life was smaller than his dreams had once been. And then his older brother, Ian Keller, made it worse. Ian had always been the kind of beta who believed one lucky turn could fix an entire life. One game. One bet. One final chance. But luck had never loved him back. By the time he came to Knox, his face was bruised, his hands shaking, and his debt tied to men who did not forgive. "They said there's a way," Ian whispered at Knox's kitchen table. Knox already hated the sentence before he heard the rest. Ian could barely look at him as he explained. Dex Moretti, one of the men circling the Deu family like a patient knife, had made an offer. Kaiser Deu was supposedly accepting another Omega into his estate. A trial. 1 week. If Knox stayed the full 7 days, Ian's debt would be cleared. Knox stared at him. "And if I don't?" Ian swallowed. "The interest stops." That's not an answer. His brother's silence was the answer. Knox leaned back in his chair and felt something cold settle behind his ribs. He understood the shape of it then. He was not being invited. He was being used. Offered up like a token in a game played by men who would never have to pay with their own bodies. Dex had called it a chance. But in the places where Mafia men smiled over whiskey, it had another name. The bet. No Omega lasted a week with Kaiser Deu. Now they wanted to see how long Knox Keller would last. Ian cried. Knox did not. He had spent too many years taking care of other people's broken pieces to fall apart when someone handed him more. He looked at his brother's swollen eye, remembered the boy who used to share food with him when they were young, and hated him a little for still being someone Knox loved. 1 week, Knox said quietly. Ian looked up. 1 week and the debt is gone? Ian nodded too fast. That's what they said. Knox looked toward the dark kitchen window, where his own reflection stared back at him like a stranger who already knew the ending. Fine. The car came for him the next afternoon. It was black, silent, and polished enough to make his neighbors pretend not to stare. The driver introduced himself as a Deu employee and said very little after that. Knox sat in the back with one bag at his feet and watched the city change outside the window. The farther they drove, the cleaner the streets became. The buildings grew taller, then fewer. The estate appeared at the top of a private road, hidden behind stone walls and iron gates. It was large, old, and too quiet, the kind of place that looked less like a home than a decision no one had dared question. The gate opened. Knox felt it before the car fully stopped. Alpha pheromone. Not released in full. Not directed at him. But it lived in the walls like smoke after a fire. Heavy, restrained, bitter at the edges. Most Omegas would have stiffened immediately. Some would have panicked. Knox only drew one slow breath and stepped out of the car. The front door opened before he reached it. A woman stood there, older, sharp-eyed, dressed in black with the posture of someone who had run the household for years and trusted almost no one. This was Celeste, the housekeeper. Knox knew it before she spoke. "You're Knox Keller." "Yes." Her gaze moved over him, quick and measuring. Not cruel, but not warm either. She had seen 7 before him. Knox could feel that history in the way she looked at his bag, then at his face, as if already calculating how long before he asked to leave. "Come inside," she said. The interior of the estate was immaculate, but not welcoming. It was too controlled, too padded with silence. Knox followed Celeste through the entrance hall and noticed things she did not point out. A safety gate near the staircase. Locks placed higher than normal on certain doors. Soft lining along one section of wall, designed to look decorative unless someone knew what they were seeing. A faint medicinal scent under the polish. Knox said nothing. Caregiving taught a person when not to ask questions. A room always told the truth before people did. "Your room is upstairs," Celeste said. "Dinner is at 7. Mr. Devereux will speak with you then." "Does he expect me to stay that long?" Celeste paused. For the first time, something almost like surprise crossed her face. The others usually asked what he expected from them. "I'm not the others." Celeste looked at him for another second, then turned away. "No," she said softly. "Perhaps not." Dinner came with a table too long for 2 people and a silence that made silverware sound too loud. Kaiser entered at exactly 7. Knox had seen dangerous men before. But Kaiser Deu did not perform danger. He wore it like a second skin. His presence filled the room before he spoke, alpha pheromone held under brutal control, his expression calm enough to be frightening. He sat across from Knox. "You can leave whenever you want," he said. "No welcome. No threat. No false kindness." Knox picked up his glass. "I was told. If you last the week, your brother's debt is cleared." "So I was told." Kaiser studied him for a moment, and Knox realized the man was not looking at his body, his clothes, or his status. He was looking for fear. Knox gave him none. "You don't seem curious," Kaiser said. "I am. But you're not asking questions." People lie when questions come too early. Something shifted in Kaiser's eyes. Not amusement. Not quite interest. More like a man hearing an unfamiliar sound in a house he thought he knew completely. They ate in near silence. Then it happened. A sound from above. A dull, rhythmic thud. Knox's hand stilled around his fork. Another thud followed. Then another. Not random. Not violent in the way rumors would have wanted. It was repetitive, desperate, almost like someone trying to hold themselves together through impact. Kaiser's face changed. Only for a second. But Knox saw it. The cold alpha mask cracked, and something raw showed underneath. Then came a cry. High, wordless, broken with distress. Kaiser stood so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Excuse me." He left without another word. Knox remained at the table, listening. Footsteps above. A door opening. A low voice, softer than he would have believed Kaiser capable of. The thudding continued, then slowed, then changed into something quieter. A murmur. A rhythm. A storm being contained by someone who had done this too many nights alone. Celeste appeared near the doorway, her face tight. Most people would have asked then. What was that? Who is upstairs? What kind of house is this? Knox did not ask. He only looked toward the ceiling and listened until the sound faded. That night, in the guest room, he sat on the edge of the bed without unpacking. The estate was quiet again, but now he understood that the quiet was not emptiness. It was exhaustion. Near midnight, the sound came again. A small impact. Then another. A broken cry. A wave of unstable pheromone rolled faintly through the hallway, young and sharp and frightened, nothing like Kaiser's controlled darkness. Knox stood. He should have stayed in his room. That was what the bed expected. That was what the 7 before him had probably done before deciding they had seen enough. Instead, Knox opened the door. The hallway outside was dim. At the far end, near the stairs leading toward the second floor, the air felt heavier. The cry came again, and beneath it, Kaiser's voice, low and steady, saying words Knox could not make out. Knox took one step forward. Then another. And in the house everyone called cursed, the 8th Omega walked toward the secret that had made all the others run. Morning came quietly inside the Devereux estate. Knox woke before sunrise out of habit. Years of caregiving had trained his body to rise before alarms, before daylight, before exhaustion had fully left his bones. For a few seconds he forgot where he was. Then he heard it. A soft rhythmic tapping somewhere above him. Not violent this time. Just repetitive. Steady. He sat up slowly and listened. The sound continued for several seconds before stopping completely, replaced by silence, so deep it almost felt unnatural. Knox dressed and left the room. The estate looked different in the morning. Less intimidating. Still cold, still too large, but no longer haunted in the way people outside imagined. Now it felt more like a place built around survival. Every hallway seemed arranged to prevent damage. Every corner looked controlled too carefully. As he walked downstairs, he noticed more details. Cabinets secured with silent locks. Rounded furniture edges. A shelf lined with medication containers labeled in neat handwriting. The kind of organization that came from routine, not luxury. Someone in this house lived according to strict patterns. Someone had to. The kitchen was empty when Knox entered. He found coffee, eggs, bread, and started cooking automatically. It calmed him. Feeding people always had. A few minutes later, Celeste entered. She stopped in the doorway. For the first time since meeting him, she looked genuinely surprised. "You cook?" "I eat," Knox replied simply. Cooking usually comes with that. Her lips twitched very slightly before flattening again. The others never came downstairs this early. The others probably weren't caregivers. Celeste watched him plate breakfast in silence. Then the sound came again. A sudden sharp cry from upstairs. Not angry. Overwhelmed. Knox froze for less than a second before continuing to butter toast. Celeste noticed. "They usually leave after hearing that," she said quietly. Knox placed another plate on the counter. "Does it help when people react like he's dangerous?" The older woman stared at him. There was a long pause before she finally sat down at the counter. "No," she admitted. Knox handed her coffee. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Celeste said, "His name is Leor." Knox looked up. "He's 4 years old," she continued. "And he's the reason no one stays." The words settled heavily between them. Celeste explained carefully, like someone used to watching people's expressions change halfway through the truth. Leor was born an alpha, but his pheromones developed abnormally early. Too strong. Too unstable. His nervous system reacted to everything. Noise, lights, unfamiliar scents, too many people speaking at once. Even another person's emotional state could trigger him into sensory overload. Most days he barely spoke. Some days he didn't speak at all. When meltdowns happened, they could last for hours. "The doctors recommended institutional care," Celeste said flatly. "They still do." "And Kaiser?" He refused. Knox leaned against the counter quietly. "He rebuilt this house for him," she continued. "Every lock. Every wall. Every routine. Everything here exists because of that child." The image of Kaiser from last night flashed through Knox's mind. The cold alpha who terrified half the city. And beneath that image, another one. A man rushing upstairs the moment he heard his child cry. "What about Leor's other parent?" Knox asked softly. Celeste's expression hardened. "He left after the diagnosis. Not died. Not disappeared. Left." Knox understood immediately why nobody in this house spoke much. Pain repeated enough times eventually stopped sounding dramatic. It just became routine. "The Omegas before me," Knox said carefully. "They all left because of Leor?" Celeste laughed once without humor. "They came here expecting luxury. Power. An alpha who could give them everything." Her eyes turned colder. Then they realized Kaiser's life revolves around a child who may never become normal. The word sounded ugly in her mouth. "They looked at Leor," she continued, "and saw inconvenience." Knox looked down at the steam rising from his coffee. Then he asked quietly, "What calms him down?" Celeste went still. Not because of the question itself, but because no one before him had asked it. "Pressure," she answered after a moment. "Routine. Predictable sounds. Kaiser's pheromones sometimes help. Sometimes they make it worse if he's stressed." Knox nodded slowly, like he was memorizing instructions instead of hearing something frightening. Celeste watched him carefully now. Not with suspicion anymore. With confusion. "You really aren't afraid?" Knox thought about it honestly. "I think," he said slowly, "people are only scared of things they don't try to understand." Before Celeste could answer, footsteps entered the kitchen. Kaiser. He looked exhausted. Dark shadows rested beneath his eyes, and the tight control around his pheromones felt strained this morning. Knox could tell immediately that neither Kaiser nor Leor had slept much. Kaiser stopped when he saw breakfast already waiting. Then his gaze moved toward Celeste. You told him. It was time, she replied calmly. Kaiser looked back at Knox. Now Knox understood something important. This man was waiting. Waiting for the expression. The hesitation. The discomfort. The moment every Omega before him realized what this house truly was. Kaiser spoke first. You're free to leave. Knox frowned slightly. It's breakfast. Kaiser's jaw tightened faintly. I mean the arrangement. I know what you meant. Silence stretched between them. Kaiser was bracing himself for rejection, so hard it almost felt physical. Knox had seen this before. Families with disabled children often developed the same expression after years of people leaving. They learned to expect abandonment before attachment. It hurt less that way. Sometimes. Did you sleep at all? Knox asked. Kaiser blinked once, caught off guard. What? You look exhausted. No fear. No pity. Just observation. Something unreadable moved through Kaiser's eyes. I'm used to it. That doesn't make it healthy. For a second, Celeste looked like she might laugh. Kaiser sat down slowly across from Knox. The silence this time felt different. Less defensive. Knox pushed a plate toward him. You should eat. Kaiser stared at the food like he didn't remember the last time someone had simply prepared something for him without obligation attached. Finally, he picked up the fork. Upstairs, another soft thud echoed through the ceiling. Knox looked up instinctively. Kaiser noticed. And there it was again. That fear. Not fear of being judged. Fear that Knox would hear Leor and decide this life was too much. Knox looked back at him calmly. I'd like to meet him. The fork stopped halfway to Kaiser's mouth. The entire kitchen went silent. Even Celeste froze. Kaiser stared at him for several seconds like he had misheard. You don't understand, he said carefully. Leor doesn't react well to strangers. That's okay. He might scream. That's okay too. Kaiser's expression tightened. He doesn't like being touched. He doesn't speak much. Sometimes he acts like people don't exist at all. Knox held his gaze. I still want to meet him. Something dangerous flickered behind Kaiser's eyes then. Not anger. Hope. The kind that terrified people more than pain ever could. Because pain was familiar. Hope could destroy you. Upstairs, another soft rhythmic thud echoed through the estate. And for the first time in years, Kaiser Deu hesitated before pushing someone away. By the third day, the Deu estate had started developing a rhythm around Knox without anyone meaning for it to happen. It began with small things. Kaiser started coming downstairs earlier in the mornings. Celeste stopped watching Knox like she expected him to disappear overnight. Even the staff moved differently around him, quieter, less guarded, as if the tension that permanently lived inside the house had loosened by a fraction. But the biggest change was Leor. Knox still hadn't touched him. That mattered. Too many people believed connection had to be forced to be real. They crowded children like Leor with noise, expectations, sympathy disguised as pressure. Knox understood something different. Presence mattered more than performance. So every morning, he sat on the floor of the sensory room while Leor rotated blocks between his fingers with intense concentration. No questions. No fake smiles. No look at me. Just consistency. And Leor had started waiting for him. Not openly. Not in ways most people would notice. But when Knox entered the room now, the child's rocking slowed slightly. Sometimes another block would slide quietly across the floor toward him. That was enough. More than enough. Kaiser noticed every single change. He noticed how Leor's meltdowns shortened after Knox spent time with him. He noticed how his son stopped hurting himself as often during overload episodes. Most terrifying of all, he noticed himself relaxing whenever Knox entered a room. That was dangerous. Kaiser Deu trusted almost no one. Trust created weaknesses, and weaknesses got people destroyed. He had spent years building himself into something untouchable because he had no choice. But Knox Keller walked into his home carrying softness like it was strength. And Kaiser had no idea what to do with that. The problem started during a meeting. Several alpha heads from connected families sat around the long table inside one of Kaiser's private conference rooms. Contracts, territory routes, shipping numbers. Normal business. The kind Kaiser handled effortlessly. Knox wasn't supposed to be there. He had only entered quietly to leave coffee beside Kaiser's chair before heading back upstairs to check on Leor. Most people would have lowered their eyes around that many dominant alphas. Knox simply set the cup down and turned to leave. Then one of the men laughed. It was soft. Disrespectfully soft. So that's the Omega? The room went still. Knox paused but didn't react. Another alpha leaned back in his chair. I expected someone prettier. Maybe Dex was right, the first one added. Kaiser finally got desperate enough to buy one. A few quiet chuckles spread around the table. Knox kept walking. He genuinely intended to ignore it. Then the last comment landed. Still, another voice said lazily, an Omega willing to stay for money probably doesn't have many options. The air changed instantly. Every alpha in the room felt it before they consciously understood what was happening. Kaiser's pheromones exploded across the conference room. Heavy, violent, terrifying. Glasses cracked against the table. One alpha nearly fell out of his chair as pressure slammed into the room hard enough to make breathing difficult. Instinct forced weaker alphas downward immediately. Silence followed. The terrifying kind. Kaiser hadn't moved. That somehow made it worse. His expression stayed calm, but his eyes had gone cold in a way that made experienced men suddenly remember every rumor they had ever heard about him. No one, Kaiser said quietly, speaks about him like that again. The pressure intensified. One of the men actually choked. Knox turned around fully then. For the first time since entering the room, he looked directly at Kaiser. And what he saw startled him. Not rage. Fear. Kaiser looked like a man moments away from losing control of himself completely. Knox crossed the room slowly. Every alpha stared at him like he was insane. An Omega approaching an enraged dominant alpha should have been impossible. Survival instincts alone usually prevented it. But Knox stopped beside Kaiser calmly. Then he placed one hand lightly against Kaiser's wrist. That was all. The pheromones receded instantly. The entire room inhaled at once. Kaiser froze beneath the touch like his body no longer belonged to him. Knox's voice stayed soft. They're not worth it. For several seconds, Kaiser couldn't answer. No one had ever calmed him that quickly before. No one had ever touched him during a loss of control without fear. Knox removed his hand gently. Then he looked around the table. You should all drink water, he said simply before leaving the room. The silence after he disappeared somehow became worse. That night, Kaiser avoided him. Knox noticed immediately. Dinner never came. The lights in Kaiser's office stayed on until after midnight. And upstairs, Leor began spiraling. The first scream hit the hallway just after 1 a.m. Knox sat upright in bed instantly. Another scream followed, sharper this time, accompanied by heavy impacts against padded walls. Then came the pheromones. Chaotic alpha pheromones flooded the upper floor, young and unstable and overwhelmed by too much sensory input. Knox could practically feel the distress vibrating through the walls. He stepped into the hallway. At the far end, light spilled beneath Leor's door. Kaiser's voice came from inside, low and strained. You're okay. Another loud impact. You're okay, Leor. Something in the tone made Knox move forward. Not authority. Not control. Exhaustion. Real exhaustion. Knox knocked softly once before opening the door. The scene inside hit him hard. Leor sat on the floor beside the bed, rocking violently enough that the entire mattress frame shook. His hands pressed against the sides of his head while distressed pheromones poured from him in unstable waves. Kaiser knelt nearby, completely wrecked. His shirt sleeves were rolled unevenly. His hair was disheveled. Dark circles hollowed the space beneath his eyes. He looked like someone who had been holding the same collapsing wall upright for years without rest. When he saw Knox, panic crossed his face. Not because Knox was there, because he expected him to leave after seeing this. Go back downstairs, Kaiser said immediately. Knox ignored the order. He slowly sat on the floor several feet from Leor instead. Another scream ripped through the room. Leor hit the side of his head again. Kaiser flinched visibly. Hey, Knox said quietly. Not to stop him. Not to demand attention. Just a voice entering the chaos gently. Leor didn't react. Knox began humming softly. A low repetitive sound. Simple. Predictable. Steady. The same rhythm over and over again. Kaiser stared at him. Minutes passed slowly. Leor's breathing remained ragged at first. His rocking stayed frantic. But gradually, almost invisibly, the rhythm of the humming began syncing with the child's movements. The screaming stopped first. Then the impacts weakened. Then the pheromones lost some of their sharp instability. Knox kept humming. He never moved closer. Never forced interaction. He simply stayed. Eventually, Leor collapsed sideways against the bed, exhausted and trembling. The room finally fell quiet. Kaiser lowered his head sharply, one hand covering his mouth for a second like he was trying to physically hold himself together. Knox looked at him carefully, and suddenly understood. Kaiser wasn't frightening because he lacked feelings. He was frightening because he felt too much and spent every second of his life forcing it back under control. Very quietly, Kaiser spoke. I thought, his voice cracked slightly before steadying. I thought eventually everyone would look at this and decide it was too much. Knox looked toward the exhausted child curled beside the bed. Then back at Kaiser. Leor doesn't need someone perfect, he said softly. Kaiser's eyes lifted toward him. He just needs someone who stays. The room went silent again. But this silence felt different. Not empty. Not lonely. Leor shifted weakly in his sleep. Then, without waking fully, his small hand reached out blindly and caught the sleeve of Knox's hoodie. Kaiser saw it, and for the first time in years, hope slipped past the walls he had built around himself. The Devereux estate no longer felt empty. That was the first thing Kaiser noticed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. The change happened through details so small they should have been meaningless. Fresh flowers appeared near the kitchen windows. The lights stayed warmer at night instead of cold and dim. Someone laughed in the hallways now, usually Celeste pretending she wasn't amused by something Knox said. The house breathed differently. And somehow, terrifyingly, Kaiser had started associating that feeling with one person. Knox Keller. It had been almost a month since the Omega walked into his life because of a debt and a cruel joke disguised as a bet. A month since Kaiser expected him to run like everyone else. Instead, Knox stayed. Every morning, Kaiser woke to the scent of coffee and faint Omega pheromones drifting through the lower floor. Every evening, he found Leor calmer if Knox had spent the day nearby. And every night, Kaiser caught himself listening for footsteps outside his office without realizing he was doing it. That dependence frightened him more than enemies ever had. Because enemies were predictable. Hope was not. Leor changed too. Not magically. Not unrealistically. He still struggled with sensory overload. He still had difficult nights and moments where his pheromones spiraled unpredictably. But now recovery came faster. And for the first time in years, he actively sought someone out. Knox. Sometimes Kaiser would walk into the sensory room and find his son sitting beside Knox in complete silence, while they rotated blocks together in matching rhythms. Other times Leor followed Knox through the house without touching him, simply existing nearby like a quiet shadow. It was the closest thing to trust Kaiser had ever seen from him. One evening, Kaiser found Knox asleep on the couch in the library. A blanket had fallen halfway to the floor. An unfinished book rested against his chest. The soft lamp beside him cast warm light over his tired face, and for a moment Kaiser simply stood there watching him breathe. It felt dangerously domestic. Kaiser crouched slowly and pulled the blanket back over him. Knox stirred slightly but didn't wake. Then something smaller moved at the edge of the room. Leor. The child stood near the doorway clutching one of his wooden blocks. He looked between Kaiser and Knox silently before walking closer. Kaiser held still. Leor hesitated only briefly before climbing onto the couch and curling beside Knox without a sound. Knox shifted instinctively in his sleep, one arm moving around the child automatically. The sight hit Kaiser so hard it almost hurt. For years this house had only known survival. Now it looked dangerously close to becoming a home. And Kaiser had no idea how to survive that. The problem was that the outside world had started noticing too. Rumors spread quickly in Mafia circles, especially when they involved Kaiser Deu losing control over an Omega. People talked about the conference room incident, about the Alpha who nearly collapsed under Kaiser's pheromones after insulting Knox, about the fact that the mysterious 8th Omega had somehow remained inside the estate longer than anyone else. That was when Dex Moretti decided to interfere personally. Dex had always smiled too easily for a dangerous man. He arrived at the estate one afternoon uninvited, carrying expensive wine and poison beneath his polished manners. Kaiser hated him on sight long before this situation ever started. Now the hatred felt personal. "You look exhausted," Dex commented casually while sitting across from Kaiser in the office. Raising a difficult alpha child alone can't be easy. Kaiser ignored the bait. "What do you want?" Dex smiled wider. "I heard the Omega is still here. He has a name." "Does he?" Dex swirled his drink lazily. Funny. Most people just call him the winner of your little bet. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Kaiser's eyes sharpened. What bet? For the first time, Dex looked genuinely surprised. Then amused. You didn't know? Silence. Dex leaned back slowly. The whole city's been gambling on how long he'd survive in your house. Honestly, I thought he'd run by day 3. Kaiser's pheromones darkened immediately. Dangerously. You used him. Oh, don't look at me like that, Dex replied smoothly. The Omega agreed. Ian Keller needed money. Knox needed options. Everyone benefits. Everyone except Knox. The realization landed like something rotten inside Kaiser's chest. Knox thought this arrangement was humiliating enough already. If he discovered the entire thing had become entertainment for rich alphas. The office door opened suddenly. Knox stepped inside carrying tea. And stopped. The silence told him everything before either alpha spoke. His eyes moved from Dex's smile to Kaiser's expression. Then back again. Dex lifted his glass slightly. There he is now. The most expensive Omega in the city. Kaiser stood immediately. Enough. But it was too late. Knox understood. Not every detail. Not yet. But enough. Enough to see humiliation written across the room like blood. The atmosphere changed instantly. Knox's pheromones pulled inward hard, retreating so fast Kaiser felt the absence physically. Knox. So that's what this was. His voice stayed calm. Too calm. Kaiser stepped forward carefully. Listen to me. The bet, Knox interrupted softly. That's why everyone looks at me like that. Dex smirked. Don't take it personally. You lasted longer than anyone expected. Kaiser moved before thinking. The glass in Dex's hand shattered against the wall beside his head. The room exploded with alpha pheromones. You will never speak about him again. Dex's smile disappeared. For a second, even he looked uneasy. But Knox barely reacted. That hurt Kaiser more than anger would have. Because Knox looked tired. Not shocked. Not emotional. Just deeply, painfully tired. Like this humiliation made too much sense for someone like him. I should have known, Knox said quietly. Kaiser turned toward him immediately. No. You didn't even deny it. I didn't know about the bet. That finally made Knox pause. Dex laughed softly. That part is actually true. But the damage was done. Knox set the untouched tea tray onto the desk carefully. Then he walked out. Kaiser followed instantly. Knox. No answer. Knox, stop. The Omega kept walking through the hallway toward the entrance. Kaiser grabbed his wrist gently before he could reach the front doors. The contact made both of them freeze. Knox looked down at Kaiser's hand. And Kaiser realized with horrifying clarity how desperately he did not want to let go. I didn't know, Kaiser said again, lower this time. Knox laughed once under his breath. Not happily. That somehow makes it worse. Kaiser's chest tightened. You think I'd let them treat you like that? Aren't they already? The words hit perfectly because they were true. Kaiser had dragged Knox into this world without realizing what it had become around him. For the first time in years, guilt hit harder than rage. Knox slowly pulled his wrist free. I need air. Then he left. Hours passed. Night fell. And Kaiser realized the house felt wrong again. Too quiet. Leor noticed it too. The child had been restless since sunset, pacing between rooms, distressed pheromones leaking unevenly into the hallways. He kept stopping near the front entrance like he expected someone to come back. Kaiser stood near the window staring at the rain outside and felt something ugly building beneath his ribs. Fear. Real fear. Not for business. Not for power. For one Omega walking away. Then the front gate alarm sounded softly. Kaiser moved before thinking. Knox stood outside in the rain near the stone pathway, soaked through and shivering slightly. He hadn't actually left the estate grounds. He just couldn't bring himself to walk back inside. Kaiser crossed the distance quickly. Knox. Rainwater slid down both of them in silence. Finally, Knox spoke without looking up. I was stupid. No. I really thought. He swallowed hard. I thought maybe this place actually wanted me here. Kaiser stepped closer immediately. It does. Knox laughed bitterly. Because Leor needs me. That's not the only reason. For the first time, emotion cracked openly through Kaiser's control. If you leave, he said hoarsely, this house goes back to what it was before. Knox finally looked at him then. And saw it. Not possession. Not obsession. Need. raw and terrifyingly honest. Kaiser touched his face carefully like he was afraid the Omega might disappear. Then he kissed him. Not rough. Not hungry. Desperate. The kind of kiss that came from exhaustion and fear and weeks of feelings neither of them knew what to do with anymore. Knox trembled against him immediately. And for one suspended moment beneath the rain, neither of them felt lonely anymore. Behind the second-floor window, unseen by both of them, Leor stood silently clutching his wooden block while watching the only two people he trusted finally stop pretending they didn't belong to each other. The hearing was scheduled 3 days after the incident in the rain. 3 days of tension, so thick it settled over the Devereux estate like a storm waiting to break. Nobody spoke about the kiss. Not directly. But everything between Kaiser and Knox had changed after it. The distance was gone now, replaced by something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. Kaiser touched Knox more often without realizing it. A hand against his lower back while passing in the hallway. Fingers brushing briefly against his wrist during breakfast. The instinctive need to check if Knox was still nearby whenever the house became too silent. And Knox noticed every single time. That terrified him almost as much as it comforted him. Because part of him still believed this couldn't be real. People like Kaiser Deu did not fall in love with people like Knox Keller. Not permanently. Not publicly. Especially not in the world they lived in. But Leor did not understand social hierarchy or public expectations. He only understood safety. And over the past month, safety had slowly begun smelling like Knox. That became painfully obvious the morning of the hearing. Leor was already distressed before the cars arrived. Too many unfamiliar scents. Too many strangers entering the property. Too much disruption in routine. By the time the inspectors and council representatives entered the estate, the child's pheromones had already begun fluctuating sharply. Kaiser noticed immediately. His own control tightened dangerously in response. Knox stepped closer before things could escalate and lightly touched Kaiser's hand beneath the dining table. The alpha steadied instantly. One of the council members noticed. So did Dex Moretti. And Dex smiled like he had just discovered a weapon. The hearing took place inside one of the formal receiving rooms downstairs. Several council representatives sat across from Kaiser, while assistants documented everything. The entire process was framed as an evaluation of Leor's safety and developmental condition. But everyone in the room understood what it really was. An attack. Dex wanted control of the Devereux inheritance, and Leor stood between him and it. Knox sat quietly beside Kaiser, while questions continued for nearly an hour. How often does the child experience violent episodes? What stabilization methods are currently used? Do you believe a private residence is truly appropriate for a child with severe pheromone dysregulation? Every question sounded clinical. None of them felt humane. Kaiser answered with controlled calm, but Knox could feel the tension radiating from him more intensely with every passing minute. Then one council member turned toward Knox. "And you," the woman said carefully. "What exactly is your role here?" The room shifted subtly. Knox understood immediately what she was actually asking. "What are you to him? Employee? Caretaker? Temporary Omega? Or something inappropriate?" Before Knox could answer, Dex leaned back casually from where he stood near the windows. He entered the estate because of a debt arrangement. The silence sharpened instantly. "A debt arrangement?" another representative repeated. Dex smiled faintly. "An unfortunate situation involving his brother. Though I suppose the arrangement became personal." Knox felt humiliation crawl beneath his skin immediately. There it was again. The reminder that no matter what this house had become to him, the outside world still saw him as something purchased. Something temporary. One council member frowned slightly. "So you were effectively brought here as payment?" Kaiser moved before Knox could even react. The temperature in the room crashed under a wave of dominant alpha pheromones. "Careful," Kaiser said softly. Every person present went rigid. Even the council representatives looked shaken. Dex smirked faintly. "There it is. Emotional instability." Kaiser stood slowly. "No," he said. "What you're seeing is me losing patience." Knox touched his wrist under the table immediately. Not because he feared Kaiser. Because he knew Kaiser was seconds away from destroying the entire hearing. The alpha's breathing steadied beneath his hand. And once again, everyone in the room noticed. The hearing should have ended there. But then Leor screamed upstairs. The sound cut through the estate so sharply that every conversation stopped instantly. Kaiser stood immediately. Knox was already moving. Another scream echoed through the upper floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of objects crashing into padded walls. "Pheromone spike," one council member whispered. Someone began writing rapidly. Dex's expression brightened almost imperceptibly. This was exactly what he wanted. Kaiser reached the staircase first, but another violent pulse of unstable alpha pheromones hit the house before he could climb the stairs. Leor was panicking badly. The council members exchanged looks immediately. Fear. Judgment. Confirmation. One of them murmured quietly, "This environment clearly isn't stable enough." Kaiser heard it, and something terrifying shifted inside him. Knox saw it happen in real time. The alpha's restraint finally cracking. The entire hallway flooded with oppressive pheromones powerful enough to make several people stumble backward. Windows rattled. One beta assistant nearly collapsed from pressure alone. Kaiser looked ready to kill someone. Then, small footsteps. Everyone froze. Leor appeared halfway down the staircase, shaking violently, his breathing ragged, eyes unfocused, pheromones spiraling completely out of control. The child looked around the room in blind panic, while strangers stared back at him like he was dangerous. And then Leor moved. Not toward Kaiser. Not toward the doctors. Toward Knox. He practically stumbled down the remaining stairs before grabbing fistfuls of Knox's hoodie with trembling hands. The room went completely silent. Leor buried his face against Knox's chest and inhaled sharply, desperate for familiar scent. His shaking gradually weakened beneath the Omega's pheromones. Knox immediately crouched down and wrapped one arm carefully around him. "You're okay," he whispered softly. "You're okay. No dramatic reaction. No forcing eye contact. Just calm. Steady. Safe." Leor's breathing slowly evened out, and every single person in that room watched it happen. Not performance. Not manipulation. Trust. Real trust. Kaiser stared at them both like the sight physically hurt him. Because for years he had fought the world alone trying to protect his son. And somehow, impossibly, Leor had chosen someone too. One council representative lowered her clipboard slowly. Another stopped writing altogether. Even Dex looked unsettled now. Knox lifted his head carefully then, still holding the trembling child against him. His voice remained quiet, but every word landed perfectly. "You all keep talking about control," he said. "About management. About whether this house is appropriate." No one interrupted him. "But none of you asked what Leor wants." The room stayed silent. Knox continued softly. "If love only counts when people are easy to care for, then people like him were doomed from the beginning." Kaiser looked at him sharply. Knox's eyes never left the council. Leor is not broken because he experiences the world differently. And Kaiser is not failing because he chose to love his son instead of hiding him away. The child's grip tightened weakly against Knox's hoodie. Knox lowered his voice further. "This house isn't perfect," he admitted. "But it's the first place where Leor has ever felt safe enough to reach for someone." No one spoke after that, because there was nothing left to argue against. Not while the terrified child, everyone called unstable, was calming down in the arms of the person he trusted most. Kaiser crossed the room slowly then, and for the first time in front of everyone, he stopped beside Knox openly. Not hiding it, not denying it, choosing him. Dex finally broke the silence with a bitter laugh. "You really fell for him." Kaiser didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on Knox and Leor. Then he answered quietly. "No." A pause. Then, "I survived because of him." The ruling arrived 4 days later. Kaiser won full custody of Leor. Dex Moretti's petition was denied entirely, along with every recommendation for institutional transfer. The council's final report described the Devereux estate as an emotionally stable environment specifically adapted to the child's needs. But the line everyone remembered came from the final page. "The child demonstrates clear emotional attachment, trust, and behavioral stabilization within the home environment." Kaiser read that sentence 3 separate times in silence. Then he handed the document to Knox without saying a word and walked out onto the back terrace alone. Knox found him there 20 minutes later. Kaiser stood near the garden overlooking the estate grounds, shoulders tense beneath his dark coat while rain clouds drifted slowly across the sky. From behind, he still looked like the same terrifying alpha the city feared. But Knox knew better now. He knew how many nights Kaiser had spent sleeping beside Leor's sensory room floor. He knew how carefully Kaiser monitored every meal, every routine, every scent that entered the house. He knew how deeply this man loved. And maybe that was the most dangerous thing about him. Knox stepped beside him quietly. Kaiser didn't look over immediately. "He gets to stay," he said at last. Knox smiled faintly. "He was always going to. You sounded more confident than I felt." "That's because one of us had to stay calm." That finally earned a small laugh from Kaiser. Brief. Rough from disuse. But real. Silence settled comfortably afterward. Not awkward. Not empty. Comfortable. That still felt new. Then Kaiser spoke again, quieter this time. "You should leave." Knox blinked. "What?" Kaiser finally looked at him. "The debt is gone. The hearing is over. Deck's lost." His expression tightened slightly. "You're free now." The words should have sounded kind. Instead, they hurt. Knox stared at him for several seconds before understanding settled slowly into place. Kaiser wasn't pushing him away because he wanted distance. He was terrified of trapping him. Even now, after everything, Kaiser still couldn't fully believe someone would choose this life willingly. Knox leaned against the terrace railing. "You really still don't understand, do you?" A crease formed between Kaiser's brows. Knox looked out over the gardens quietly before speaking again. "For most of my life, people only needed me when they were hurting." His voice stayed calm, but softer than usual. "Patients. Families. My brother. Everyone loved what I could do for them. Nobody ever stayed once they didn't need me anymore." Kaiser's expression changed immediately. Knox laughed under his breath. "So when I came here, I thought this would be the same. 1 week. Take care of the child. Leave. But now?" Kaiser asked carefully. Knox looked toward the second-floor windows where Leor's room overlooked the gardens. "Now I can't imagine waking up somewhere else." Something fragile crossed Kaiser's face then. Hope. Still cautious. Still disbelieving. But alive. Knox stepped closer slowly. "And honestly," he admitted quietly, "that scares me too." "Why?" "Because loving people means they can hurt you." Kaiser's gaze softened in a way that would have shocked anyone else in the city. Then he lifted one hand carefully against Knox's cheek. "I would rather die," he said softly, "than become another person who hurts you." The honesty in his voice shattered something inside Knox completely. So he kissed him first this time. Not desperate like the rain-soaked kiss outside the estate gates. This one was slower. Warmer. Certain. Kaiser pulled him closer immediately, one hand settling firmly against his waist while familiar alpha pheromones wrapped around them both like instinct. For the first time in years, neither of them felt lonely. A small sound interrupted them. Both turned instantly. Leor stood several feet away near the terrace doorway, clutching one of his wooden blocks. His expression remained difficult to read as always, but he stared directly at them without distress. Then very deliberately, he walked toward Knox and held up the block. Knox's chest tightened painfully. He crouched slowly to accept it. "Thank you," he whispered. Leor pressed the block into his hands, then immediately leaned sideways against Knox's shoulder. Physical affection from him was still rare enough to feel miraculous. Kaiser looked away sharply for a second. Knox knew immediately why. "You're crying." "I'm not." "You absolutely are." Kaiser laughed quietly under his breath while wiping at his eyes once with clear irritation. "This is your fault." "Probably." Leor shifted between them calmly while Knox rose back to his feet. And standing there together beneath the fading afternoon light, they finally looked like what they had slowly become. A family. Not perfect. Not conventional. Not easy. Real. The months afterward passed quietly, which, for the Devereux estate, was its own kind of miracle. The house continued changing around them in small ways. The kitchen stayed warm later into the evenings. Leor started tolerating outdoor spaces more often if Knox stayed nearby. Kaiser slowly stopped treating rest like weakness. And Knox stopped feeling temporary. That took the longest. Sometimes he still caught himself waiting for the moment everything would disappear. Waiting for Kaiser to realize he deserved someone more elegant, more polished, more worthy of standing beside a man like him. But Kaiser never gave those fears room to grow. Not with words alone. With consistency. The same way Knox had once loved Leor into trusting him. Kaiser loved Knox carefully. Repeatedly. Daily. By staying. The wedding happened almost a year later in the estate garden. Small. Private. Quiet. Exactly what they both wanted. Celeste cried openly despite pretending she wasn't emotional. Several staff members looked more invested in the ceremony than either groom. Even the weather cooperated for once, soft sunlight filtering through the trees surrounding the garden paths. Kaiser stood waiting beneath the flower arch wearing black instead of traditional ceremonial colors. His eyes never left Knox. Not once. And Knox had never felt beautiful before. Not truly. But the way Kaiser looked at him made beauty feel less like appearance and more like being deeply known. The ceremony itself remained simple. No grand speeches. No dramatic vows. Just honesty. Just choice. Just two people who had spent their entire lives expecting abandonment and somehow found someone willing to stay. Near the end of the ceremony, small footsteps crossed the grass. Leor. The entire garden fell quiet instantly. The child walked directly toward Knox, carrying a familiar wooden block in both hands. The same kind he had pushed across the sensory room floor months ago during their first meeting. He stopped in front of Knox and placed it carefully into his palm. Knox's throat tightened immediately. Beside him, Kaiser closed his eyes briefly like the emotion hit too hard to look at directly. Because they both understood what it meant. Leor had reached for him again. Just like the first time. Only now, Knox wasn't someone temporary standing inside the Devereux estate because of a debt or a bet. He was home. Knox closed his fingers around the wooden block with one hand. And with the other, he reached for Kaiser. The alpha held on immediately. Tight. Certain. Never hesitating. And for the first time in all their lives, none of them were waiting for someone to leave anymore. Because soulmate was never about perfect pheromone compatibility. It was about the person who stayed beside you when your world became too loud to survive alone. And maybe that was the real meaning of love in the end. Not perfection. Not fate. Not even pheromones. Just finding someone willing to stay beside you when the world becomes too heavy to carry alone. Thank you for listening. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay for the next story.